Welcome to the Fiscal Physical Podcast. Join us each week as we sit down with the founder of Alchemy Wealth Management and author of Your Fiscal Physical, Ryan Nelson. Tune in to gain valuable insights and practical tips as we simplify complex financial concepts into digestible lessons. From budgeting to retirement planning, this podcast is your go-to resource for mastering financial literacy.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of the Fiscal Physical Podcast. My name is Aaron. I'm the host of this podcast, and I want to thank everyone who's been joining us throughout this journey and increasing your financial literacy. I'm joined, as always, by the founder of Alchemy Wealth Management, Ryan Nelson. Ryan, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you doing today, Aaron?
I am doing fantastic, thank you. How are those book sales going of Your Fiscal Physical?
They're flying off the shelves.
Yeah. Do you actually have them in any physical stores? Like, it's just Amazon right now, right?
That's a good question. I don't know that I think it would just be on Amazon. I'm fairly ignorant about the backside of like book sales. I do know that you can buy it on other places other than Amazon.
Okay.
But I actually haven't verified, so I doubt it's in any bookstores, but I don't know 100%.
Yeah, that'd be pretty cool. You're like in Barnes and Noble, which I think is still open. You're like, hey, cool. Your fiscal physical. I know that guy, but we're super excited to be here with you guys. Appreciate everyone who's been listening. If you have any questions, feedback, email us at podcast@alchemywealth.com. But I'm super excited to dive into this topic. I was listening to the previous episodes, and I feel like I say that I'm super excited for every topic, because I am. Like, I feel like these are really awesome topics that we're discussing, but this one specifically is one that's very relatable to everybody in the world, really. I mean, people who have traditional IRAs versus Roth IRAs, that might be more of a select group, but everybody should have emergency savings.
Absolutely.
In a way. So we're going to talk about emergency savings here, and I'll go ahead and let you take that away, Ryan. What are emergency savings? What aren't they? And how should a person determine those?
Yeah, so I mean, your emergency savings is effectively, it's a pool of funds you have that you could access in an emergency. And so, I mean, at the highest of levels, that is what it is. What it is not retirement planning. It's not a kid's college savings. It's not a pool of funds to pay off your mortgage, right? It is in itself just a pool of funds that you have set aside that you can access in case of an emergency. So it's for an unscheduled emergency. It's something you would not have otherwise been able to predict.
Okay. Well, that makes sense to be able to. And sometimes I feel like just in life in general, it's people can tell you what something is, but I always feel like it's better to tell you what it's not. And I feel like you just broke that down really nicely to be like, hey, this isn't something that you're saving up to pay your house off with. This isn't something that you're, cool, I'm going to use. It's not your Roth savings or you're like, cool, I have all this money in my Roth that I can pull out whenever. We learned that's not true.
Yeah.
But as far as emergency saving go, how should a person... What format should that be in, I guess, if that's the right word?
Yeah, so you're going to want it to be liquid, meaning you can access the money. So if let's say there was heaven forbid, there was a true emergency this evening, you would want to be able to access the money quickly and probably without penalty or fees, right? So you'd want it to be what we call liquid. Typically, you'd want that just to be sitting in what we call a cash or cash equivalent. So money in your checking account or your savings account. Funny enough, a savings account is a great tool for your emergency savings, right? And so the reality is, like I mentioned before, this is not an investment account, right?
Right.
And so I hear a lot of people getting really caught up over, should I move these funds over to this other account or into the CD or into something else that gets me a little bit better return? And what I would tell you is, maybe, but the initial purpose of your emergency savings is not to maximize the returns on your savings. It's to be able to access the money quickly and easily in the case of an emergency. So again, this is not your retirement planning. So, if it's currently in an account getting 4% savings and you heard there's some other online savings account out there getting you 5% savings, I'm honestly not that worried about it. Like, this account is, again, not there to maximize your investments. It's there to be able to access easily, simply whenever you need to. That said, I mean, if there are tools out there where, if the money's just going to be sitting there for the next 30 years and there is a tool to get you an extra 1% or 2% or 5% more, I don't have a problem with you pursuing that. But again, I think sometimes people get a little too caught up in it, and it's like, okay, let's remember what this account was for. I'm not as worried about what the interest rate you're getting on your savings account is. I'm more interested in you having a certain amount, having it set aside, being able to access it in the case of an emergency, and whatever rate of return you're getting on that, cool, great. But that's not the purpose of these funds.
Yeah, and with a lot of things with finances, I've learned through doing this podcast, it's very obviously everything's very personal to you, a specific person, your situation. How would you go about if you're talking to somebody to talk to them about an emergency savings, and how much should it be? Like, how do you make that determination? Yeah.
So that's one of the obviously the biggest questions people have around emergency savings. And what I would say is so maybe one of the primary tools for this account is it allows you to keep all the rest of your investments invested. So as you're working, as you're putting money into your 401k and into your Roth IRA and into your different retirement accounts, and an emergency pops up, we want you to be able to have a long-term strategy for all those investments accounts and be able to continue that long-term strategy, right? Yeah. So for example, if we put money into, we had a plan of putting money into your 401k, an emergency comes up, well, we were planning on not touching that money for another maybe 30 years, right? Now an emergency comes up, you have to borrow money out of your plan or make an early withdrawal, maybe pay a 10% penalty, right? That really starts messing up our plan, and maybe to the point where you actually don't plan the same way to begin with. Right. Mm-hmm. But if we were able initially to set enough aside to begin with, where if an emergency popped up, you wouldn't have to alter your long-term retirement plan at all, then that means we've created a nice little emergency savings there, right? So think of your emergency savings as like basically a cushion to allow you to execute your long-term plan, sort of, I'll put in air quotes, no matter what emergency might arise. So this gives you the availability to follow and execute your long-term plan, even with the bumps along the road. Because obviously things are going to come up, your car breaks down, you need new tires, whatever. We want that to not impact your long-term retirement strategy. Your emergency savings is the account that we can kind of access to allow us to give us the flexibility to continue to follow that long-term strategy. And so now you said, how much should I have in my my plan, right? And so I think there'd be a few main variables. That general rule of thumb is going to be 3 to 6 months. Mm-hmm. So some people say 3 to 6 months of expenses. Some people say 3 to 6 months of income. If we were to think about this kind of high level, let's use, again, easy math. So if an individual was to earn $60,000 a year, that would come out to be a nice round $5,000 a month. Mm-hmm. So if we were to apply the same logic, we might say, okay, their emergency savings should be somewhere between 3 and 6 months. So 3 and 6 months of $5,000 a month would be somewhere between $15,000 and $30,000 that they would want set aside in their emergency savings. So that's kind of a big difference. Is it 15?
Right.
Is it 30
or 30?
Yeah,
that's a lot. That's a huge difference.
So what I would say is you could probably get a little more detailed there and say, if we think about what this is, it's really to cover expenses. So instead of, if you were earning $60,000 a year, do you need $5,000 a month? That's what you're making, but really you're putting some of the, the government's taking some of that in taxes. Like you're really probably only spending, $3,500, let's call it $4,000 a month, right? For nice round numbers again. So if you're only spending $4,000 a month, really, if we apply the same rule of thumb, you probably only need somewhere between like 12 and 24,000. But we still have the same issue. Is it 12 or 24,000, right? And so a couple of variables I think you could look at to kind of help guide you on which end of that spectrum you need to be. One would be if you're dual income household or single income household. So if you're the only, if you're single, that means you're the only one earning money for your household.
Right.
Or even if you are married, but you are the sole income earner for your household, well, that's a higher risk. Now, if you were to lose your job for any reason or quit or become disabled or, get hurt, any of those reasons, you might lose that one income, right? Mm-hmm. So you'd want to be a little more aggressive with your emergency savings and maybe trend towards that 6 months, right? If you have two incomes coming in, maybe you can afford to have a little bit less in emergency savings. If one of the two people was to lose a job, well, that's okay. We still have some other income coming in. We wouldn't need as much saved in emergency savings. And what are the odds that both parties of the couple lose their jobs at the same time. Well, I don't know. Maybe that depends. Are you both working at the same company? Are you both in the same industry? Are you both, right? I mean, if you have two drastically different jobs, maybe the likelihood of you getting laid off at the same time, maybe you determine is low. And so you say, yeah, we could probably stay closer to the lower end, the 3-month threshold, right? So that'd be one variable. Are you a single income household or dual income household?
Yep.
Another one I would say is kind of look at your job security. If you're in, say, a union, or if you're if you're a professor and you have tenure, you probably have fairly good job security.
Yeah.
If you're working construction and you're used to getting laid off every time it snows, and we're approaching winter, maybe your job security is not so good, right? So again, if you the higher job security you have, you could tend towards 3 months. The lower job security you have, you'd want to push up towards 6 months, right? Another thing would just be your risk tolerance.
Oh, I love a good risk tolerance.
Oh yeah. How could you not?
Yeah.
So as you look at this emergency savings as well, if it's always this fine line how much you keep in emergency savings. Your emergency savings, like I said before, it's not really doing anything for you. Like you might just have it in a savings account earning you 0%, right?
Right.
Again, the purpose of the emergency savings is not investment returns. So when we look at this, like, yeah, we want as little as possible in our emergency savings because it's not doing anything for our long-term goals. But the flip side of that coin is we need enough in it to accomplish whatever that quote unquote emergency could be in the future. And so it's this fine line, you want as little as possible, but you need to make sure you have enough. And so it comes down, a level of it comes down to your risk tolerance and how comfortable are you. So somebody who has a more aggressive risk tolerance could maybe keep less in their emergency savings, and somebody who's naturally a little more conservative would probably want to keep a little bit more in their emergency savings, right? And so that would be high level. I think, some of the factors you would use to determine, to figure out, hey, should you be at 3 months? Should you be at 6 months? So again, if we were to take this person, if earning $60,000 a year, they, maybe they have dual income, pretty secure jobs. Maybe they say, yeah, we only need 12, or 3 months of income. So they say for us, we're going to have 15,000 in our, emergency savings maybe. And that'd be a fair amount. The only other point I'll leave there is that rule of thumb, 3 to 6 months is most accurate for sort of, an average income earner. It becomes less useful for really high income earners and really low income earners. So if you were working, 10 hours a week and earning $20,000 a year, and you tried to apply the same logic, maybe you're only putting a few $1,000s in your emergency savings, that might not be enough. Like, you might, if you have to go put new cars or new tires on the car or something, like that might not be enough, in emergency savings to allow you to continue to execute your long-term goal, right? So if you're on the very lowest end of this, you might need to save a little more than 6 months in your emergency savings. And the opposite is true as well. If there's somebody out there making $50,000 a month instead of a year, right? So making $600,000 a year, do they really need to be saving $300,000 in emergency savings? Like, what emergency would pop up where you need $300,000 cash? Right. That's a little bit extreme. So, kind of, I think 3 to 6 months for sort of a average American income, so to speak, and then just apply some logic to it. So if that cash starts getting really high where you're holding, 6 figures, you have $100,000 or more in emergency savings, you might start wanting to kind of challenge that rule of thumb and say, do I really need this much in emergency savings? And vice versa is true as well. If you're holding, such a small amount in emergency savings and you're like, well, I'm at 6 months, but then your kind of logic is pushing back on you and saying, but I just don't know if I have enough in emergency savings. Probably you don't. So you always want to pick a number that you're comfortable with, that's low enough that you don't want too much in cash. You want enough, you want it to be low enough where you can put all the rest in, kind of to work for you, right? But also a high enough amount that you're comfortable, and if any emergency comes up, it still allows you to execute your long-term retirement strategy without skipping a beat. Yeah,
and it seems like there's so much that goes into just everybody's personal opinion. I remember when I met my wife, because I've always had like an emergency savings, like just myself. I'm like, oh, like something happens, you have to put tires on the car, or whatever. And like, I remember talking to my wife, and she's like, or my girlfriend at the time, and she was like, oh yeah, I don't keep as much in my emergency savings. I was like, well, how much do you keep? She's like, 0. And I was like, well, that's pretty lean. There's a difference between like, running lean and like not having anything in there. So I think that it's one of the things as we've grown together, and like, you kind of get an idea on what your emergency savings need to be, and you take your day to day. You're like, okay, cool. Well, if this happens, or obviously you don't think the worst case scenario, but you're like right in the middle of like whatever might happen, and it's the best way to kind of look at it.
I actually love that you brought that up too. So yeah, you also don't want to plan for the worst case scenario, like you said. I mean, you could come up with these crazy scenarios where you're like, I need to keep all my money in emergency savings because I don't know what could happen. Like, what if I'm laid off for the next 2 years and I have to buy a new house and buy a new car and do? It's like, well, if there's ever a true emergency, you can access all your retirement funds. You could get money out of your Roth. You could get money out of your traditional IRA. You know, you'd have to work with your CPA to see if you'd be penalized on that stuff. But the reality is you could access those other funds. So you don't want to plan your emergency savings for this like 1 in a million scenario, right? Yep. It's because then that would put you way too far on this extreme where you're saving way too much cash. You're not putting anything to work. So yeah, good point. You don't want to plan for the worst case scenario. You want to plan for like a reasonable bad scenario. Do I have enough money set aside where, you know, again, keep using this example, you know, I could put new tires on the car.
Sure.
Even that, I would prefer you to be saving for that money, like strategically, right? And not using emergency savings. Hopefully, if you're planning for, you know, when you buy new tires, you're going to have to replace them. Hopefully you're saving over time and that's not an emergency. That said, maybe you buy new tires the next, you had budgeted for it, you planned for it the next day. For some reason the tires get destroyed, not covered by a warranty. Okay, there's an emergency.
Right. No, that's a good way to kind of, you know, and tires is something that's pretty relatable because everybody drives a car.
Right.
Like, so I think that's a pretty good one for sure. But awesome, Ryan. I think that was a great kind of high level, you know, conversation on emergency savings here. We'll go ahead and pause here, be back on the other side with some personal stuff.
Awesome. Sounds good.
And now to put the personal in personal finance.
All right, we are back here, the Fiscal Physical Podcast. Let's get into some personal stuff here. I've been really curious about this, Ryan, since I've known you. About how knowledgeable were you growing up in your household about your family's finances? Like we've touched on it before in this podcast and just in life about how a lot of people don't talk about finances at home. But I'm curious. You're a naturally curious person in general. I'm curious. I'm wondering, how involved were you, or how knowledgeable were you with your family's finances growing up?
Yeah, probably kind of averagely involved. Certainly, I didn't know like what my parents' net worth was, or even I don't think I knew what their income levels were as I was growing up. I do know that information now, especially since being in the industry, but I really don't think I knew that information growing up. I did know, you know, like that they owned stocks, and I knew they had investment accounts. I knew they put money into their 401k. You know, I don't know that I knew how much money like we as a family had, or how much disposable income. And it's really hard to know even now. Like if you meet somebody and they are driving a 20-year-old car, does that mean, are they driving a 20-year-old car because you know, they can't quote unquote afford a new car? Or are they driving a 20-year-old car because they've been piling tons of money into their retirement and making wise financial decisions? Right? So you know, you could see the same thing, and maybe it's a reflection of them making poor financial decisions, or them making really wise financial decisions, right? And it's hard to know which it is. And so, like, you know, similarly, like, you know, in high school, you know, my family wasn't the family that you know bought us a car at age 16 to drive to school. So like you kind of start to get a feel like, okay, maybe my parents aren't like multimillionaires. Right. Right. Yeah. But also at the same time, like we never wanted really for anything. Right. And, you know, I was fortunate. My mom was working across the street at the time, so they allowed me to drive one of their cars to high school. Right. So, you know, I was, you know, perceived to be probably better off than a lot of kids in my school, and a lot of other kids were perceived to be a lot better off than us, I suppose, probably. Yeah. But yeah, so overall, I'd say I was probably just like averagely involved. Like I didn't have a great understanding. What about you?
I really had zero idea of my parents' finances until I got to be in like later high school years, and I had like an economics class that I took in college or in high school. Like I think it was my senior year, and we had to do like your net worth and like figuring out these different things. And it was really cool to kind of see. Cool. And it kind of got me thinking. I was like, let's see what my parents make. And then I did like my FAFSA like the next year to go to college, and like you have to put your parents' income on these things, and like I remember getting like their tax returns and checking it out and being like, holy smokes, we're poor. Like it's what I just looked at it like. And but I was in the same boat. Like I grew up with, there was 4 siblings, myself and 3 kids, like, or 3 sisters. We didn't really want for anything. Right. Like it's just like we couldn't go on like the trip to Washington D.C. or something like that. Right. Like it was just like, okay, that's fine. I got other things to do. But I always had like basketball shoes for growing up and stuff. And like it was really funny. Like I see those numbers actually, and I'm like, oh wow, we're in like the poverty level, like if you will. Yeah. But it's just kudos to my parents for not really making that like part of it. But at the same time, I'm like, I think that now that I have a son, I'd like him to be at least knowledgeable of like finances from a young age and what kind of goes into it. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, definitely it's important stuff. So the younger they can start getting that education, the better. And it is funny how you say that, like the correlation between income and happiness just doesn't really exist, right? Like I haven't looked at the numbers in a long time, but I think you basically get happier for every additional dollar you earn up until like it's like 70,000. It's pretty steep up to like $70,000 or something.
Sure.
You know, in that point you can put a house over your head without having any stress. You're probably getting rid of a lot of these stresses, right? You can go get sushi when you want, go to the movies when you want. And then at a certain level, which isn't that high, I can't remember the numbers, but you know, maybe in the order of magnitude of like 150,000, happiness actually starts going back down. And so, you know, a lot of these wealthiest people in the world, you know, their happiness isn't actually as high as somebody who is making a lot less. And so it just goes to show you, like, the money isn't what is making people happy or not happy. It's some other factor. Who knows what that is? But yeah, kind of interesting.
Yeah, it all is very interesting for sure. But awesome. I think that's a great place to end this one here. We want to thank all the listeners. Make sure you check us out. You can find us pretty much where any podcasts or where you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the different ones for sure. Please, you know, check us out, rate, follow, comment, subscribe, whatever the different things are. And I'll leave you to send us off here, Ryan.
Yeah, as always, stay the course.
Thank you for joining us for the Fiscal Physical Podcast. Until next time, happy listening. And as always, stay the course. If you have a question or topic suggestions, please email us at podcast@alchemywealth.com. If you enjoyed today's discussion, subscribe to the podcast to ensure you never miss an episode. And consider leaving us a rating and review on your favorite platform. This helps other listeners like you find the show. For more resources, you can visit Alchemy Wealth Management's website at www.alchemywealth.com or find your Fiscal Physical, the book, on Amazon. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention that personal finance is just that, personal. Please don't take anything we say as advice. The preceding content is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It's not an offer or a solicitation, nor should it be construed or relied upon for tax, legal, or investment advice. It doesn't consider your personal financial situation or objectives and may not be suitable for you.